I originally thought that the European Union was one of the world's three major powers standing alongside China and the United States. Unexpectedly, it turned out to be just a fat sheep in a wolf's skin. Ursula von der Leyen, who was still high-handed during the China-EU summit, immediately turned around and signed a tariff agreement with the United States that can be called a deal humiliating Europe and forfeiting its rights. Alice Weidel, leader of the Alternative for Germany, said that the US-EU tariff agreement is a resounding slap in the face of Europeans. Bernd Lang, chairman of the European Parliament's Committee on International Trade, stated that if the EU had taken a tough stance earlier and joined forces with China to counter Trump's tariff threats, it might have obtained better terms. But there are no ifs in this world. Before the current worst-case scenario emerged, the EU originally planned to have it both ways between China and the United States. Von der Leyen planned to put pressure on China and use China's concessions to make up for the losses caused by concessions to the United States. However, at this China summit, China did not give an inch. During the meeting in Scotland, Trump also insisted that the EU accept the 15-0 tariff framework in a $1.35 trillion investment and procurement agreement, with no room for negotiation. In the end, von der Leyen had to give in to Trump. The plan to have it both ways turned into being caught in a dilemma. The United States finally completed the harvesting of the EU. And Trump scored another victory. Viktor Orbán, Prime Minister of Hungary, said that the US President ate von der Leyen for breakfast. This vividly describes the current US-EU relationship and also raises a question. As one of the world's three largest economies, why did the EU, which clearly could have sat at the dining table, end up on the menu? Against the backdrop of Sino-US competition, the European Union was originally a powerful ally that both sides were striving to win over. Why did it end up being an object to be divided up, with the United States eating the meat and China drinking the soup? How have Europe's relations with China and the United States changed? During the meeting in Scotland, Trump proudly laid out various conditions, while von der Leyen, like a humble schoolchild, obeyed Trump's demands without the slightest resistance. After the agreement between the two sides was reached, even Americans found it hard to believe and even suspected it was fake news. Some White House officials even mocked, saying that the EU had directly knelt down to Trump. In fact, in this round of tariff wars, if the EU had chosen to cooperate with China's strategy and stand firm against the United States, it would never have ended up in today's situation. China, the United States, and the European Union are currently the most important political, economic, and cultural forces in the world. With its huge economic scale, highly integrated market, and global influence in multiple fields, the EU has become a core force in the world economic pattern. Regarding such an important force, I have always had high expectations for Europe in the past. I hope that the EU will not be coerced by the United States and will not become a first aid kit for the United States. The establishment of the EU was to resist the blood-sucking of the United States. However, things went against expectations. The EU's overall perception of China and the United States has had serious deviations, which eventually led to major mistakes in its foreign and economic policies, resulting in the unfavorable situation today. All along, the European Union has consistently positioned China as a triple role: a cooperative partner, an economic competitor, and an institutional rival. The EU and China are highly interdependent. According to data from Eurostat, in 2024, the EU's exports to China stood at €213.3 billion, while its imports from China reached €517.8 billion, resulting in a goods trade deficit of €304.5 billion with China. China is the EU's largest source of imports, accounting for 21.3%, and its third largest export market, accounting for 8.3%. In response to this, Ursula von der Leyen once stated that China is having the largest trade surplus in human history, which she believes is caused by China's overcapacity and government subsidies. Moreover, she argued that the EU is a huge market for China, so China needs the EU more. Von der Leyen used this to put pressure on China. However, the truth about China-EU trade is that the EU accounts for approximately 15% of China's total exports, while China makes up 20% of the EU's total imports. The EU market is less important to China than China is to the EU, and the EU is more dependent on China's supply chain. The fundamental reason lies in the EU's irreplaceable reliance on China in terms of key resources such as rare earths, lithium magnesium raw materials, lithium batteries, as well as intermediate products in the manufacturing industry. If the supply of these products is cut off, it could bring the EU's industry to a standstill. In contrast, China has reduced risks through market diversification and industrial chain autonomy. I believe this is also the reason why China did not give an inch in the negotiations of this round of China-EU summit. At the same time, China and the EU are gradually forming a competitive landscape in high-quality manufactured goods. With China's industrial upgrading, it has made breakthroughs in multiple areas of high-end manufacturing, which has severely undermined the competitiveness of European products and exports, thus turning the two sides into competitors. Beyond that, the EU also positions China as an institutional rival, stemming from differences in ideology and political systems. Europe is the birthplace of modern systems and industry, and has seen the rise of several powerful empires in history. Therefore, the EU considers itself a maker of the rules governing world order. However, China has achieved tremendous progress in economic development and technological innovation over the past few decades, and has gradually gained a say in formulating the rules of the future world order. This makes Europe very uncomfortable, as China's changes have made it feel a sense of crisis. This fear has led Europe to subconsciously want to suppress China, so it chose to sacrifice its own interests and end up on the dining table. Such a cognitive mismatch has become an obstacle to China-EU relations. Against the backdrop of Sino-US competition, the root cause is that Europe has been exploited for too long and dare not take the first step to resist. Europe tends to show weakness to the United States to stop losses, yet uses supporting Russia as a fundamental aspect of China-EU relations to coerce China into making concessions. Von der Leyen said that China is actually fueling Russia's war economy, which Europe cannot accept, and that the future development of China-EU relations depends on the interactions between China and Russia. Speaking of which, don't you think there's something illogical here? Even if China were really helping Russia, would that have a causal relationship with von der Leyen betraying the EU? Does it mean that if you hate someone, you throw away your own money? From the perspective of ordinary people like us, this is completely unreasonable. In my view, it is Europe that really needs to reflect deeply on the Russia-Ukraine issue. In the past, Europe made huge profits by relying on American technology and markets, China's complete supply chain, and Russia's cheap energy. However, the United States provoked the Russia-Ukraine war, cut off Europe's cheap energy pipelines, causing a sharp rise in the production costs of European manufacturing industries. This eventually led to the closure or relocation of enterprises, increased living costs for the people, and exacerbated social unrest. It can be said that it was the United States that opened the prelude to Europe's decline. Essentially, after decades of layout in Europe, the United States has finally reached the moment of harvesting. Moreover, as mentioned earlier, the EU was established to counter the economic plunder of the United States, but the EU elections actually elected pro-American factions. It is simply a fantasy for the EU to safeguard its own interests. Do you agree? After World War II, the entire Europe was reduced to ruins and relied on American assistance to complete reconstruction. During this process, the United States also completed its economic penetration and control over Europe. At the same time, Europe formed NATO in the name of suppressing Germany and confronting the Soviet Union ideologically, and invited US troops to station there. In this way, Europe embarked on a fast track of peaceful development under the protection of US soldiers. But how could the United States fail to see Europe's little schemes? Therefore, the United States has fostered a large number of agents in Europe through various means, especially now that the core personnel of the European Parliament and the European Commission are almost all bought by the United States. Coupled with more than 370 military bases distributed in Europe, the EU is directly held tightly in check. Through political kidnapping and military control, the United States has finally achieved economic exploitation. The United States is now facing a huge debt hole and is in urgent need of external harvesting to make up for itself. It originally wanted to contain China, but after using various means, it still failed. Then it planned to carve up Russia, but after 3 years of fighting, Russia is still fighting tenaciously with no sign of falling. In fact, in my opinion, the EU's support for Ukraine is nothing more than to let Russia fall first. To let Russia be on the dining table first, so that after the United States is full, the EU will not have to be on the dining table. But the United States can't wait any longer and has to start with its allies. Japan, South Korea, Europe, etc. will all be harvested, especially Europe. Having been raised for so many years, it has long become a big fat sheep, and it is time to be slaughtered. Therefore, with complete control over the EU's politics, economy and military, the United States has completely cut off Europe's energy supply, forcing a large number of European enterprises to relocate overseas. The United States has accepted some of them, and China has also taken the opportunity to accept some, such as Germany's BASF, Siemens, Schultz, Denmark's Danfoss, Switzerland's air purifier companies and other well-known enterprises. These are the pillars of European industry, but now they are gradually moving to China and the United States. The United States has taken the lion's share, while China has picked up some scraps. But this is still not enough to satisfy the US appetite, which is why it later wielded the indiscriminate tariff stick against the whole world. China chose to stand firm to the end and also hoped to pull Europe together to jointly cope with the tariff pressure from the US. However, no one expected that the EU would want China to make huge concessions to please the US, only to end up on the menu itself. I really don't know what to say. Are there any European viewers here? Feel free to share your thoughts. If the EU cannot recognize its own predicament and resolve its internal contradictions, it will ultimately only be able to survive hardship in the cracks of Sino-US competition. What are your thoughts on this? Welcome to leave comments and discuss.